My name is Alex, and before I tell you anything else, you need to understand one thing. I used to believe that if you did your job quietly, carefully, and honestly, the system would eventually protect you. That belief died on a freezing night halfway up a mountain road, with no signal, no backup, and a radio that stayed silent long enough for the truth to settle in. I work as a night technician maintaining telecommunications towers in a mountainous region where villages, highways, and emergency services depend on equipment installed decades ago. The job is simple in theory and brutal in reality. Drive for hours in the dark, climb steel structures iced over by wind, replace failing components, log the work, and move on before sunrise. I liked the isolation. I liked knowing that when people made calls, streamed music, or reached emergency responders, it worked because someone like me had been there. When Mark Hale arrived as the new regional manager, most of us didn't react much. Management changes were common, and they usually stayed far away from the towers themselves. Mark was different from the start. He visited the field, shook hands, learned names, joked about how numbers don't mean much without people. I wanted to believe him. For the first few weeks, nothing seemed wrong, but then the patterns started to appear, subtle enough that you could doubt your own instincts. Certain clients' outages were treated like disasters, triggering immediate responses, extra crews, and praise from above. Other outages, sometimes in more dangerous or remote areas, were quietly labeled non-critical and pushed to the next shift, then the next. When I raised concerns, Mark didn't argue. He smiled, nodded, and said, "Let's be practical, Alex. We can't save everyone at once." The words sounded reasonable, but the consequences weren't. One night, a small mountain town lost signal entirely. No internet, no phone service. The alert came in, and I flagged it as urgent because the tower served a stretch of road known for accidents. The response came back delayed, casual. Log it, monitor it, wait until morning. I felt a tightness in my chest as I followed the instruction. Hours later, I learned there had been a crash. No emergency call went through for nearly 20 minutes. No one died, but someone came close, and that was enough to keep me awake long after my shift ended. I confronted Mark the next day, calmly at first. He listened, his expression sympathetic, then asked me if I had proof that my judgment was better than the system's priorities. That was the first time I felt something shift against me. After that, my assignments changed. I was sent farther out, alone, to towers everyone knew were unstable. My requests for assistance were missed, equipment shortages were blamed on logistics, and then came the night that broke everything. A storm rolled in faster than forecasted, cutting visibility to nothing. I was dispatched to a tower Mark himself flagged as high priority earlier that evening. Halfway there, the task was downgraded through a quick radio message: "Finish if possible, otherwise log and return." I reached the site anyway. The structure was iced over, the access road barely passable. As I climbed, the wind howled hard enough to shake the frame. Midway through the repair, my radio crackled and went dead. When I finally descended, soaked and exhausted, I checked the logs later and saw the entry that sealed my fate. The outage was now attributed to delayed response and technician judgment. My name was attached. No call to ask if I was safe, no message to check what happened, just a quiet administrative note shifting responsibility downward. Sitting in my truck, hands still trembling from the cold, I felt something heavier than anger. It was the realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding or poor management. It was deliberate. Mark didn't need to cause failures. He only needed to decide which ones mattered and who would absorb the damage. And people like me were expendable. As dawn crept over the mountains, I understood that explaining myself wouldn't change anything. Protesting would only accelerate what had already started. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. And in that moment, staring at the tower silhouetted against the pale sky, I accepted a truth I had been resisting all my life. This wasn't going to end with fairness. It was going to end with consequences. After that night, I didn't suddenly turn into someone fearless or decisive. The truth is uglier and quieter. For weeks, I lived in a constant tug of war with myself. Every shift began with the same question looping in my head. Do I keep my head down and survive, or do I push back and risk losing everything I've built? I told myself I wasn't planning revenge, not yet. I framed it as self-preservation. I needed to understand the shape of the trap before I moved at all.
Fear is an excellent teacher when you stop pretending it isn't there. I was afraid of losing my job, of being labeled reckless, of becoming that cautionary tale whispered to new hires. I was also afraid of something worse, that if I stayed silent, I'd become complicit. That fear followed me up every ladder and down every access road. I started paying attention in a way I never had before, not just to alarms and diagnostics, but to tone, timing, and absence. Mark's instructions were rarely written. They came late at night, phrased casually, often framed as suggestions rather than orders. If it's not resolved by morning, we'll reassess. Let's not overreact to this one. I began to log everything for myself, not officially, just timestamps, radio traffic summaries, who said what and when. At first, my hands shook when I did it, like I was committing some kind of betrayal. Then it became routine, almost boring. The internal conflict didn't disappear. There were nights I sat in my truck after a shift, staring at the steering wheel, wondering if I was imagining patterns because I wanted a villain to justify my anger. Doubt is insidious that way. To test myself, I took small risks. Nothing dramatic. I asked neutral questions in group calls, questions that couldn't be interpreted as accusations. Can we clarify the priority criteria for rural outages? Silence would follow, then Mark's voice smoothing everything over without answering. I requested backup on a particularly dangerous site, citing weather and equipment age. The request was acknowledged and then quietly ignored. Each time I felt the pressure increase, like the walls narrowing by inches. The first real obstacle came when a coworker pulled me aside after a shift. He told me, gently but firmly, that my name was coming up too often in conversations I wasn't part of, that I should stop asking questions if I knew what was good for me. Hearing it out loud sent a cold shock through me. I went home that morning and seriously considered walking away. I had savings, I could find other work, but quitting would mean Mark's version of events would stand unchallenged, and the next technician would take my place without knowing the risks. That thought hardened something in me. I decided that if I was going to fall, I wouldn't fall quietly. Still, I wasn't ready for confrontation. I needed leverage, or at least clarity. I began to comply with Mark's instructions exactly as given. No improvisation, no quiet fixes, no personal judgment calls. It went against every instinct I had developed in the field. The consequences were immediate and disturbing. Minor issues snowballed, delays multiplied, complaints increased, but they were routed upward, not toward me. Watching it happen filled me with guilt and dread, but also with grim confirmation that the system depended on people like me bending rules to cover its flaws. One night, I received a call rerouting me away from a known unstable tower toward a less critical site tied to a high-paying client. I hesitated, finger hovering over the radio button, then acknowledged and changed course. That decision haunted me all the way up the mountain road. When I checked the logs later, the unstable tower was marked as pending technician availability, with my name attached as unavailable. It was a lie built out of my silence. That was my first failure, and it nearly broke my resolve. I stopped sleeping properly. Every choice felt like a potential catastrophe. I knew Mark was watching me more closely now. Assignments were spaced just far enough apart to exhaust me. Any mistake would be amplified. The resistance wasn't loud or overt. It was procedural, polite, and relentless. And then, unexpectedly, a small opening appeared. During a routine coordination call, Mark contradicted himself about an outage timeline. It was minor, the kind of thing no one would challenge in the moment, but I had my notes. I didn't call it out, I let it pass. Later, I compared it against recorded radio traffic that was standardly archived for safety compliance. The discrepancy wasn't incriminating on its own, but it was real. For the first time, I felt something other than fear. Direction. I wasn't chasing revenge anymore. I was tracing a fault line. The success was fragile and invisible, but it was enough to keep me moving. I knew now that Mark's power relied on assumption and fatigue, on people not having the energy to compare one moment to the next. As I shut down my truck at the end of that shift, I understood that the path ahead would be slow and dangerous and that I might still lose, but I also knew that doing nothing was no longer an option. By the time I realized how far things had gone, the line between observation and action had already been crossed. The small notes I kept, the careful listening, the exact obedience to instructions had started to shape outcomes whether I wanted them to or not. I was no longer just documenting a flawed system. I was exposing its dependence on invisible labor and unspoken compromises. That knowledge came with a weight I hadn't expected. Every time I chose not to intervene, not to improvise, I felt complicit in the damage that followed. And every time I considered stepping back in, I knew it would erase the evidence I was slowly gathering. The conflict wasn't just with Mark anymore. He was inside me, grinding me down with each shift. The first truly bold move I made wasn't planned. It came out of exhaustion and anger. During a coordination meeting, Mark casually reassigned me to cover an entire corridor of towers alone over the weekend, citing operational flexibility. I heard myself respond evenly, asking him to repeat the instruction and clarify whether backup would be on standby given the weather forecast. The call went quiet. When he answered, his tone sharpened just enough to be unmistakable. No backup. Make it work. I acknowledged and ended the call, heart pounding. I knew that exchange had changed something. From that point on, the pressure intensified. I began receiving calls outside of protocol, late at night, asking for favors, quick fixes, unofficial reroutes. I refused them all politely, citing procedure. Each refusal felt like pulling another thread. Then came the unexpected turn. A junior dispatcher I barely knew asked to speak with me after a shift. She was nervous, glancing around as if the walls might listen. She told me she'd been instructed to alter timestamps on outage notifications to align with management reports. She didn't know why, only that it felt wrong, and that my name kept coming up as someone who needed watching. Hearing that shook me more than any threat Mark had made. It meant the problem was bigger, more layered, and that my actions were already rippling outward. I faced a moral dilemma I couldn't avoid anymore. If I encouraged her to come forward, she could lose her job. If I told her to stay quiet, I'd be protecting the very system I was trying to expose. I said nothing definitive, only that she should protect herself and keep records. That half measure haunted me. The next week brought consequences. A delayed response to a rural outage led to a public complaint that reached local media. Mark moved fast, issuing statements that blamed field-level decision-making under adverse conditions. I was summoned to a formal review. Sitting in that room, listening to my work reduced to selective incidents and sanitized language, I felt a surge of anger so strong it scared me. When I spoke, I stuck to facts, timelines, procedures followed exactly as instructed. The panel deferred judgment, but I could see the outcome forming. That night, alone in my truck, I seriously considered breaking ranks, calling a reporter, ending it all in one reckless move. The thought terrified me because part of me wanted it. Instead, I drove until dawn, letting the exhaustion dull the impulse. The unexpected consequence came days later. A severe storm knocked out multiple towers simultaneously. This wasn't manageable through selective priorities. Emergency services were affected. Mark issued rapid-fire instructions, contradicting himself repeatedly. I followed each one precisely, logging acknowledgments through official channels. The chaos exposed cracks I hadn't anticipated. Calls were recorded, dispatch logs conflicted. For the first time, people above Mark started asking questions he couldn't smooth over. But the cost was high. I watched crews scramble, watched communities go dark longer than necessary, and felt the weight of every minute. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Sleep became shallow and fragmented. I jumped at radio static. I dreamed of alarms that never stopped. The turning point came when I received a private message from someone I had trusted early on, a senior technician who had mentored me. He warned me that Mark suspected I was building a case and that a plan was forming to suspend me pending investigation. Betrayal cut deep, but clarity followed. There was no safe middle ground left. Either I acted decisively, or everything I had endured would collapse into a narrative written without me. As the storm response wound down, I reviewed the accumulated records, the contradictions, the human cost laid bare by events no one could fully control. I understood then that my next step would put everything at risk: my job, my reputation, even the fragile trust of colleagues caught in the crossfire. But retreat was no longer an option. The fault line I had been tracing was about to rupture, and I would be standing directly on it when it did. The week after the storm felt like walking through a building that had already caught fire, pretending the smoke wasn't there. Everything looked normal on the surface: scheduled maintenance, routine alerts, coffee-stained desks. But underneath it all, the air had changed. People spoke softer. Dispatchers double-checked before answering. Technicians stopped joking on the radio. Mark, on the other hand, acted almost cheerful, the way a man does when he believes he has regained control. That was what scared me. He wasn't panicking, he was adjusting, and when someone like Mark adjusts, someone else pays. I knew that someone was supposed to be me. The suspension threat wasn't just a rumor anymore. I started noticing small administrative moves: my access permissions delayed on renewals, my equipment requests rerouted for verification, my shift assignments shifted last minute so I had less predictable coverage. None of it was dramatic enough to scream retaliation. All of it was designed to make me stumble. The first time I felt the plan truly enter its critical stage was when an email went out announcing an upcoming regional performance audit. Not a full external investigation, not a scandal, just a standard review triggered by the storm and the media complaint. The date was 2 weeks out. The timing made my stomach clench. An audit meant scrutiny. It also meant Mark would have a window to shape the narrative and remove loose ends. If I waited, I'd be boxed into defending myself on his terms. If I moved too early, I could look like a disgruntled employee trying to sabotage management. My revenge, if I was honest about what it had become, was no longer about making Mark suffer for my pride. It was about forcing the truth into a form that couldn't be brushed aside with charisma and blame shifting. I kept telling myself that to stay grounded. Still, the emotions weren't clean. Some nights I sat in my kitchen staring at the wall, hands clenched until my knuckles hurt, imagining Mark losing everything. Then guilt would hit me, because if he fell, others might fall with him. Dispatchers, supervisors, even field techs who had only followed instructions to survive. That moral weight was my biggest risk. Mark didn't need to destroy me through paperwork. He could destroy me by making me choose between my own survival and the collateral damage of exposure. The plan I moved forward with was built around one principle. I would not manufacture anything. I would not trick people into lying. I would not endanger customers to prove a point. I would simply stop absorbing the system's failures and stop protecting Mark from the consequences of his own choices. That meant holding to procedure with an almost painful discipline. Every instruction had to be acknowledged through official channels. Every change of priority had to be confirmed. Every request for rerouting had to be routed through dispatch. The recorded systems were already in place for safety and compliance. Mark's power depended on slipping between them. I began closing those gaps. It sounds simple, but it made every day feel like a minefield. Mark reacted quickly. He called me directly one night, voice warm, almost friendly. He said he wanted to clear the air, told me he admired my dedication, that the storm had been hard on everyone. Then he offered what sounded like relief. He would move me to a more stable territory, fewer remote climbs, a chance to reset. It was bait. Moving me would isolate me from the most chaotic sites, the ones where his contradictions were most visible. It would also make it easier to say later that I was removed for performance. I thanked him, asked for the details and the standard scheduling system. The warmth in his voice cooled. He insisted it didn't need to be formal. I insisted it did. The call ended with a silence that felt like a door closing. The unexpected twist came from someone I did not expect to matter. A contractor, one of the drivers who delivered replacement parts to remote depots, started speaking to me during a late pickup. He wasn't friendly.
He was cautious, almost resentful. He asked if I was the guy making everyone nervous. I kept my face neutral and asked what he meant. He hesitated, then said something that turned my blood cold. He'd been asked to report on where I went, when I stopped, whether I talked to anyone. Not by Mark directly, but by a supervisor I'd known for years, a man who used to share road stories with me. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. Mark wasn't acting alone. The network was broader, and it was willing to watch me like a criminal. That night I sat in my truck outside my apartment building, engine off, hands resting on the wheel, feeling the urge to vomit. I wanted to quit, to run, to disappear. Instead, I forced myself to breathe and think. Surveillance meant fear. Fear meant I was closer than I realized. The plan had to adapt. I reduced my movements. I stopped casual conversations at the yard. I became a ghost. At work, I was polite, efficient, almost dull. Inside, my heart hammered constantly. Each time my phone rang, I expected the suspension notice. The audit date crept closer, and the atmosphere tightened. Mark held meetings about lessons learned, projecting leadership. He spoke about accountability and field discipline, his eyes sliding over me briefly like a threat disguised as professionalism. I watched colleagues nod along, some convinced, some trapped. Then another complication landed. The junior dispatcher who had warned me about altered timestamps suddenly took medical leave. No goodbye, no explanation. The absence punched a hole in my stomach. Had she been pressured, scared, paid off? I realized how fragile my human links were. People vanished when the heat rose. I had to rely on systems, not allies. The critical stage came 3 days before the audit, during a high-pressure outage affecting a hospital corridor. Multiple towers were flickering, not fully down but unstable. Mark issued a directive through dispatch to prioritize the hospital coverage and ignore the cascading issues in rural zones until morning. The directive was spoken quickly, framed as an emergency necessity. I asked for confirmation in the dispatch system, citing safety protocol. There was a pause. Then the dispatcher, voice strained, repeated Mark's words and logged them. My throat tightened. This was exactly what I needed and exactly what I feared. Because the moment those instructions were formally logged, Mark's deniability shrank. But it also meant he would strike harder, faster. Within an hour, my access to the network monitoring dashboard was revoked, temporarily for maintenance. I couldn't see real-time status. I couldn't verify dispatch claims. I was blinded. The trap was closing. Yet, paradoxically, the move revealed Mark's hand. He was trying to cut me off before the audit, to keep me from producing clean records. I felt a surge of rage, hot and sharp. Then, beneath it, a calm I hadn't felt in months. He was forcing the issue. There would be no gentle resolution. That night, I went through everything one more time. My notes, the officially archived radio logs, the dispatch confirmations, the timeline of contradictions, the pattern of blame. I arranged it in a sequence that didn't require interpretation, only observation. It wasn't a dramatic gotcha. It was a picture of a man using a system to protect himself and sacrifice others.
At dawn, I parked outside the regional office where the audit team was scheduled to arrive. My phone buzzed with a message from Mark. "We need to talk before today." I stared at it, pulse thudding, knowing that whatever he planned for that conversation could ruin me or save him. I turned off the screen, stepped out into the cold morning air, and walked toward the building as if I were heading into a storm I could no longer avoid. I didn't reply to Mark's message. I walked past the glass doors of the regional office, nodded to the security guard, and took the stairs instead of the elevator, using the time to steady my breathing. My hands were shaking, not from fear anymore, but from the sheer release of tension that comes when you finally stop pretending there's a way out that doesn't hurt. The audit team was already there, clustered around a conference table with laptops open, faces neutral, efficient. Mark arrived moments later, perfectly composed, jacket crisp, smile practiced. He looked surprised to see me, just enough to register annoyance beneath the surface. The meeting began the way these things always do, with summaries and polite acknowledgments of the recent storm response. Mark spoke confidently about leadership under pressure, about prioritization, about lessons learned. When questions came, he answered smoothly, directing blame toward environmental unpredictability and field-level judgment. Then one of the auditors asked for a detailed timeline of specific outages, including the hospital corridor incident. The room shifted. I watched Mark's posture tighten just slightly. He gestured toward dispatch logs, toward procedures, toward policy language. That was my moment, and it terrified me. I raised my hand and asked, calmly, if I could clarify the sequence of instructions issued that night. No accusations, no emotion, just clarity. The lead auditor nodded. I laid out the timeline exactly as it existed in the system. The verbal directive, the logged confirmation, the subsequent revocation of my access, the delayed responses downstream. I didn't editorialize. I didn't speculate. I simply connected one recorded fact to the next. The silence that followed was heavy, not dramatic, but final. Mark tried to interrupt, then stopped himself. The auditors asked for the raw logs. They asked for dispatch recordings. They asked for access histories. Each request narrowed his space to maneuver. When Mark spoke again, his voice was still controlled, but the warmth was gone. He suggested I was misinterpreting normal operational stress. The auditor looked at him and said evenly that interpretation wouldn't be necessary if the data spoke clearly. It did. Over the next hours, the room filled with quiet keystrokes and low voices. I sat there, drained, watching a structure I'd learned to fear collapse, not with a crash, but with the soft sound of truth being acknowledged. The outcome wasn't cinematic. There were no handcuffs, no shouting. Mark was asked to step out. Later, I learned he was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. Supervisors who had enabled him were flagged for review. Dispatch procedures were frozen and reassessed. Some people cried. Some avoided my eyes. The contractor who had warned me sent a brief message later that day. Guess it's out now. The relief I expected didn't arrive immediately. What came instead was a deep, aching exhaustion. In the days that followed, the consequences rippled outward. The junior dispatcher eventually returned, quiet and distant, her records now part of a broader inquiry. A supervisor resigned abruptly. Others were reassigned. The system didn't heal overnight. It limped, exposed, and uncomfortable. As for me, I was offered a choice that felt almost cruel in its normalcy. Stay in my role under new oversight, or take a severance package and leave quietly. I spent a long night thinking about it, replaying everything I'd done and everything it had cost. Revenge, I realized, wasn't the moment Mark lost power. It was the moment I stopped absorbing blame that wasn't mine. That came with a price. Some colleagues would never trust me again. Others thanked me in private, afraid to say it out loud. The work itself felt different.
Climbing towers after that, I noticed how much fear I'd been carrying in my body, how it had narrowed my world. I took the severance, not because I was broken, but because staying would mean living forever in the aftermath, measuring my worth against what I'd exposed. Leaving felt like reclaiming something quieter, my own sense of direction. On my last night shift, I drove one more mountain road, just to feel it, just to remember why I'd chosen this work in the first place. The towers stood against the dark, indifferent to human schemes. The signal held steady. As I turned back toward the highway, I thought about what I'd learned. That systems don't protect the honest by default, that silence is often mistaken for professionalism, and that revenge, when stripped of fantasy, is rarely about punishment. It's about refusing to disappear. I didn't win cleanly, and I didn't lose completely. What I gained was something harder to define but impossible to take away. The knowledge that when the moment came to choose who I was, I chose to be visible.